Prepare to live stream. Stream. And we are live. Okay. So if you guys want to share in your Facebook, that's the link.
Okay, I can't share my screen using Zoom.
Yeah, we'll give you permission in 1 minute.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. All right, giving you permission to share. Mr. Richard,
Okay.
you can try now.
Let's see. Looks like it's working.
All right, it's working. So before we start, VP Sheila, you might want to greet our viewers.
Yes, good afternoon mga Kapix Pro. It's 5 o'clock once again on a maybe a gloomy Friday afternoon. So thank you everyone for joining us, no? So gusto ko lang batiin ang ating mga kaibigan. So we have si Riz Balbasro, ang ating one of our fans, no, always watching us every Friday. We also have we also have Miss Chris Reyes and Sir Tyron or Tyrion. Okay, maybe sa ano to, no, Game of Thrones, si Tyrion Lannister ba to? Yes. And of course, no, si Mr. Del Sandugo na laging umaattend sa ating mga cases and also mga trainings. So thank you, Sir Del, for joining us once again.
May hashtag pa siya, VP Sheila, Pix Protect PH Cyberspace. Kabisado na nila. Thank you, ha, Del.
Yes.
Admit.
All right, Mr. Chair.
All right, so we also have Mr. Ray Delizo is watching. Si Abby Hernandez, Rene Rodriguez, Sherwin Tors. So our friends are starting to arrive. No, si Chris Reyes. Good afternoon. Pix Protect PH Cyberspace din ang kanyang hashtag. No? And si Christopher J. Potot. Good afternoon. Pix Pro watching from Cebu. So we have viewers from Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao.
Yung hapon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Alan Brazil Tulod. How are you? And so our topic for today is very hot topic. Almost everyone is talking about zero trust. Never trust. Is that the same as never trust or zero trust? Is it never trust?
I kind of like to say trust but verify, to quote Ronald Reagan from a long ago.
So luckily, we have our expert from Tenable that will talk to us about zero trust. I think this is for this month alone, this is the 5th time I've heard someone talking about zero trust. But I have always been a fan of the Tenable solutions, even before it became Tenable, in the early years of the solution. I've been using that solution already until it became commercialized, until it became bigger, until it became tenable. All right.
Sounds like you were using it back in the day when it was open source and free.
Yep, and it was easier to recompile. But you know, back in the old days, we didn't have the luxury of money to buy software. No, so luckily these tools, like the one like this one, is for free, still free during that time, and we were allowed to recompile, especially the back end. No?
Yep.
But
There is still a free version of a variant of Nessus called Nessus Essentials you can download, but it's restricted to only being able to analyze a subset of private IP addresses, but it's still useful for education purposes or testing your own stuff if you want.
Yep, for training purposes, that's what we were using also for the students to do actual utilization of Nessus. Okay, BP Sheila, we have our friends already ready to listen. Would you like to do the honors?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So our topic for today, like you mentioned, is all about zero trust. It's a very timely topic, and I think a lot of our partners now are talking about zero trust. Okay, so for today, we have the Chief Security Architect for Critical Infrastructure of APAC, Mr. Dick Boucher. He's going to share us insights about zooming in to increase risk due to interdependencies that exist between formerly isolated infrastructures, highlighting the steps that operators must take now to help mitigate the new, growing, and wild threats surface. Also, in his presentation, he'll be addressing the latest CISA and NIST guidance on how to defend critical infrastructure and enterprises against ransomware attacks. Okay, so with no further ado, let me pass the mic now to Dick. Dick, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how things have changed, what zero infrastructure or zero trust infrastructure looks like, and I'm going to try and pivot it towards how you would secure critical infrastructure in your environment. And by critical infrastructure, I mean the stuff that makes the lights work, the stuff that makes the water flow, and all that kind of stuff. Because there is definitely an interconnection and a relationship between devices and things on the outside world and things on the inside. So we'll begin, and I can get my thing to cooperate. So basically, the agenda is this slide here. We'll talk a little bit about the rise of untrusted infrastructures and how things have changed since the days of the beginning of the pandemic, and how we have adapted to the new normal, which is not going to change. I think it's the way it's going to be forever. We'll talk about how critical infrastructures intersect with many different untrusted networks, which creates a bit of risk for those critical infrastructures. And then we'll talk about some strategies. So, and along also with, I think, what I like to use as a global reference is our recommendations from NIST, which are normally excellent. Okay. So first, a quote from Forrester, and I think this is actually very, very, very true, that trust in and of itself is a vulnerability. And given that trust is a vulnerability, again, going back to the Ronald Reagan quote from the 1980s, trust but verify is in essence what he said, and that remains to be very sage advice. Okay, because at the end of the day, when you're anonymously connecting two compute resources over what amounts to untrusted networks owned by third parties, you can never be completely sure who you're talking to, which means that mutual authentication and maintaining the integrity of the messages as they traverse this untrusted infrastructure must be maintained. And just think about pulling out your handphone and sending a WhatsApp message, right? Do you trust the service provider? Do you trust the path through the network that that traffic is going to take? And do you trust the fact that no one is going to intercept that message? And the fact is, without the methodologies employed by WhatsApp to ensure that you are indeed talking to who you think you're talking to, none of this would actually work. So the whole foundation of modern computing is really based a lot on concepts exposed by Zero Trust. Today, we find ourselves working from a place that I like to call wherever land. Okay, the pandemic has changed how we work, and it's changed how we work forever. The majority of people who have been exposed to the convenience and basically, as far as I'm concerned, almost luxury of working at home on a frequent basis, really don't want to go back to the office all the time. I think we're going to basically embrace a hybrid model. So what it means to me is that these methodologies of working from anywhere, which I call wherever land, which is a coffee shop, hotel room, a beach with a Wi-Fi hotspot, or your kitchen, this is not going to change. And that means that the compute resources and the data that you have on the compute resources that are assigned to you by your employers will have to work safely and reliably in untrusted environments. A coffee shop is not trusted. If you look at your house, your kids all have computers. God knows what they're doing on these computers, right? It could be downloading all kinds of really nasty stuff, and you're protected in your house by a router that probably costs no more than $25 supplied by the service provider. You're not safe. So it means that it's the responsibilities of organizations to ensure that the resources that they've deployed that are exposed to these unsafe environments remain secure, and that the authenticity of both the person behind the device and the device itself is maintained to a very high standard. Otherwise, it's going to be basically chaos. I think everyone on this call will definitely agree with the points I've just made on this slide. The other interesting thing that's happening, actually at a fairly rapid clip, is that we're beginning to see smart buildings, smart cities, smart traffic grids, smart power grids, the interjection of privately owned generation resources into the power grids. That would be solar cells and wind farms, all not controlled by a central authority anymore, like the old-fashioned power company, but all which must be integrated into these normal utilities. What this means is that these external networks, these external influences, are going to be feeding information in real time into the traditional infrastructure providers. And the traditional infrastructure providers are going to make decisions in real time based on the information that they're getting from devices and sensors that are beyond their control. So this means, for example, if I use Singapore as an example, okay, if you've ever been to Singapore, you know there's canals everywhere to help prevent flooding. And every 300 or 400 meters, you're going to see a little box that says PUB on it, Public Utility Board, with a little antenna coming out. Those boxes are all attached to flow meters. And the flow meters are measuring the volume of water that's going through any one of these canals at any given time. If you've ever been to Singapore, you know how hard it can rain, okay, which means that a lot of these canals are going to reach a flood stage very quickly. If somebody compromises these devices, these sensors that are located in insecure locations, they could effectively lie to the utility, causing them to not open the floodgates at the marine barrage, just as an example, and then causing flooding within Singapore. So that's just one very simple example. Another example might be if I do a coordinated attack against privately owned power infrastructure, solar cells that people put on their houses. typically what's going to happen during the day is the solar cells are going to generate an excess amount of electricity. This electricity is going to be sold back to the power grid, and the power generation company is going to use traditional fossil fuels to basically supply the difference between the power required at any given point and the power being supplied by the green methods. If all these machines in a coordinated way again lie to the power provider may not generate enough electricity and cause power disruptions. So there is the point of all this is, in addition to working at wherever land, we also have a lot of untrusted sensors that are beginning to permeate critical infrastructure, either directly or more likely indirectly. So we have these two intersections and these two things that are beginning to have impacts on how critical infrastructures work. This slide will actually drive it home, I think, a little bit more depth, because there's some very concrete examples here. So again, I might have non-utility owned solar cells, wind plants, and battery backup systems that are supplying power to the grid and telling the grid how much power is being injected or consumed even. I have smart buildings that will tell the grid how much power I'm drawing, and the grid can also talk back to the smart buildings and tell the smart buildings to shed load during certain peak periods. I always have our good old friend social media, which has influences on just about everything. I have this environmental sensors that I just described. So again, another example, everybody's baking in heat waves. Well, that's again another thing that's telling the power companies how much power to put in. And of course, with what's going on in the Ukraine, I even have geopolitical tensions that have an influence on things. So these are all indirect influences on critical infrastructure. I've been through these subjects before many, many times, so I'm not going to talk to them. But these are weaknesses that are directly present within critical infrastructure. So basically what we're saying is that this increased convergence, the whatever land, the ability to work from wherever I want, and the emergence of indirect sources of risk are imposing direct risk against critical infrastructure at this time. And it's beginning to get worse and worse as time moves forward. And just give a few minutes of thought. It's pretty easy to conjure up ideas of various ways that people could attack your critical infrastructure without actually touching your critical infrastructure. You just, excuse me, you just basically lie to it. Okay. So we are now again seeing a transition from the traditional perimeter security to the emergence of zero trusted network. In the past, okay, very important, critical infrastructures were designed to operate in isolation. We had this thing called the air gap. And operators of critical infrastructure said, hey, my network is not tied to anything. It's completely separate and independent of everything, and nothing can get in. A couple of things. That's no longer true because of the convergence I just discussed. The second thing is, I believe it was never true. And here's why. The second I walk into a plant with a laptop that's ever been connected anywhere else, then I've broken that air gap. The second I walk into a plant with a thumb drive that's ever been connected to a machine that was connected to the internet, I've broken the air gap. So the fact is, perforations in air-gapped environments, despite the best efforts of the owners of this infrastructure, have existed pretty much forever. And again, that perforation is becoming worse. As I said earlier, the wherever land working model is here for good. It's not going to change. I'm pretty sure most people on this call would probably agree with that. And external infrastructures are intersecting with critical infrastructure in ways we have never anticipated, possibly in ways that we don't even know or understand. So the end result of what you need to do is very simple, although it's not simple in implementation. Do not implement implicit trust. Because something is on my network is not a reason for me to trust it. Nothing can be trusted by default. Everything must be verified. In other words, authentication, and as well as the data that's moving across the wire at any given point in time. And the things that you can do when you're accessing a critical infrastructure from outside, from an untrusted world, is that you need to be exceptionally selective about what things you're going to allow to access your critical infrastructure. So that means, for example, if I have a vendor and the vendor is performing maintenance on some piece of equipment within my critical infrastructure, I'm going to give that vendor only access to the piece of equipment that he or she is maintaining. And I'm going to give that vendor only the privileges to do what he or she needs to do in order to accomplish the objectives of the maintenance activity. So in other words, we need to be very, very, very precise in terms of what's allowed once external access is granted to something that's a critical infrastructure. So these are kind of like the ground rules, the way it was and the way it has to be. Now, if I go to my good friends at NIST, okay, they've written paper after paper after paper on zero trust. And most of the, in fact, all of their material is excellent. I'm an American citizen, and I can say I'm very proud of the contribution that my tax dollars are making towards helping the planet secure itself, because this is all typically federally funded. So the foundations of zero trust are composed of 5 pillars. The first pillar is the necessity of having or being able to identify the person, the entity, the piece of software, whatever it is that's attempting to accomplish something over a zero trust connection. Equally important, and this is actually very critical, is that the zero trust environment must also have a device. I think best practice would be that any organization that requires somebody to have remote access to a highly sensitive environment should issue a specific device for the employee to use to accomplish that access. That device would be owned by the company and strictly maintained by the company and patched by the company. So that device, whether it's an iPad, whether it's a laptop, whatever it happens to be, is something that's really locked down and can only accomplish the single objective for which it's intended. So now I've got 2 things I trust. I've got a person who's identifying him or herself with multiple factor authentication, and I've got a device that is configured and hardened to be appropriate to the task at hand. The next thing that I need to do is I need to ensure that the transit is secure. Now, typically in a zero trust environment, I'm going to be leveraging third-party networks. That means that all the data that goes over these third-party networks must be authenticated. It must be encrypted so that no one can look at it. And you must have what I call message authenticity, meaning cryptographical methodologies in the packet transmission that ensure that the packet has not been modified while it's in transit. Okay, so I'm looking for what technically is called a message authentication code, or MAC. So all this will ensure that as my sensitive information traverses the untrusted 5G network and the untrusted internet itself, that my message is exactly the same, received in exactly the same way as it was transmitted without modification. Fundamental, very fundamental and very important. I need to severely limit the applications that I'm going to allow when I implement Zero Trust networking. And that goes to what I was saying on a previous slide. You can't, what people are allowed to do needs to be very, very, very limited, only to what is absolutely positively essential and nothing more. The more you add, the more risk that there's going to be and the more chances that will exist for a breach. And lastly, of course, we always have to guard against the leakage of any sensitive data, which is pretty much old school. In order to accomplish or in order to achieve the objectives stated by these 5 pillars, we need these 3 things. We need visibility and analytics so you can monitor what's going on and understand how it's being used. You need a high degree of automation and orchestration because trying to do all of this using manual methods will be virtually impossible. And most important, at the bottom layer of the foundation is I need well thought out and well designed governance to know what I need to do and know how that's going to be embraced and how it's going to be measured. So this is what I need in order to accomplish proper Zero Trust. Now, NIST goes into a lot of details, okay, about what needs to be done. I'm just going to briefly touch on each of these. Again, first of all, anything that's a data source and or computer service is considered to be a resource that needs to be managed. All information must be secured. I kind of made this clear in a previous slide, independent of where it happens to be within the network. This is very important. Access to individual resources is granted on a per session basis. And that simply means I don't give somebody carte blanche access. For example, a vendor attempting to perform maintenance on a piece of critical infrastructure will be granted access for a limited amount of time to do a specific task. And that's it. And the gateway that's controlling the remote access, the Zero Trust access, will enforce the rules that I have granted that user for that particular session. So I have the right as a maintenance guy to perform maintenance on one programmable logic controller deep within my operational technology environment. I give the operator the right to only touch that device and no other device for an allocated amount of time. And if he needs more time or needs access to something else, he can ask me and I can give it to him. Okay. Access to resources is determined by a policy that is dynamically enforced. And you note here it says it may include behavioral and environmental attributes. And all that means is that if the behavior of the access begins to deviate from what is prescribed, then you have probably the responsibility and obligation to shut it down and stop the access because something malicious might be going on. Very important is tenet number 5, which is to monitor and measure the integrity and security posture of all owned and associated assets. And let me tie that into the device I was describing a few seconds ago. The device I gave an employee that employee is to use for secure remote access. That device needs to be monitored. It needs to have vulnerability assessment performed on it on a frequent basis. Its configuration needs to be audited, and it needs to be patched frequently whenever a vulnerability might emerge on that device. So I'm not only protecting the user, I'm not only protecting the network by Zero Trust networking, but I also have a responsibility to protect the assets that are part of the chain, whether those assets are located inside of a secure environment or whether those assets are located out in the field in the very dangerous place that you call your home network. Okay. All resource authentication authorization needs to be dynamically and strictly enforced before access is allowed. I like to call this dual or triple factor authentication. So let's go back to last year. Last year, we had the Colonial Pipeline breach. The Colonial Pipeline breach was accomplished simply by the attacker somehow gaining the username and password to an employee who was no longer working for Colonial Pipeline. Three things are broken here. Number one, the account of the former employee should have been eliminated. That gets rid of 100% of that risk. Number two, there was no two-factor authentication. If there had been two-factor authentication, even with the credentials, the user would not have had the ability, or the attacker would not have had the ability to compromise the network, because he would have been asked for the second factor and he wouldn't have had the second factor. Taking it a step further, if you look at it, the access to this VPN of Colonial Pipeline was taking place purportedly from someplace in Russia. Why in God's green earth would somebody in Russia need to connect to a VPN someplace in Mississippi? It just doesn't make sense, which means that triple factor authentication also has a place. So something you know, which is your password, something you have, which is a token, where you are. 3 factors. Really does an awful lot to help prevent attacks. Last but not least, we have the requirement to collect data about asset security, effectively monitoring, so that you can detect when something is amiss and take proactive measures to stop the attack as and when it may be occurring. The things where the word Tenable just appeared are places where Tenable can actually help you to accomplish the objectives that I've just stated. So let's have a quick look. And now I'm going to tie it into where can I practically deploy Zero Trust in the real world. And what I'm looking at here is the intersection between a plant and an enterprise. And what I'm assuming is that the plant area is the place that I need to get access to. And I need access from outside here, the Zero Trust area. So what we're saying, at least in this diagram, is that explicit Zero Trust needs to be implemented here at the intersection between the critical infrastructure and the untrusted world. So this is where the Zero Trust actually needs to be practically deployed. For a plethora of reasons, it is not practical to deploy Zero Trust concepts once you get deeper into the plant, simply because the equipment there doesn't have the horsepower to do it, number one. Number two, it would make deployment of the infrastructure exceptionally complicated. So it doesn't belong there, it belongs here. And these devices here are what are going to be needed to enforce the specific things that you're allowed to do once you're granted access into the sensitive parts of the facility. So this is kind of a quick shot of where Zero Trust can be practically deployed in a real world scenario. Now, one thing that's, I think, fairly critical is that Zero Trust and the whole problem goes way beyond just what I've been talking about a lot lately, which is IoT. The places that enterprise touches, the exposure of an enterprise is greatly expanding as time moves forward, primarily because there's increased web or internet-facing assets. We have web applications we didn't have before. We're making use of public cloud infrastructures. And of course, we have traditional on and off-premise software vulnerabilities. So the problem of enforcing Zero Trust networking adequately begins to take into account exposure management. What's my exposure? What do I need to do to help lock that down in the event that there are issues of vulnerabilities related to that exposure? So Tenable, one of the good things about Tenable is that we're very broad in what we do because we have the ability to manage 100% of your cyber exposure, independent of where that exposure happens to be at any given point in time. Okay, so unlike other competitive operational technology solutions, the other guys, to be honest, can only do this, and we can do all this, which is probably a good thing. Okay, so trust is very much dependent on visibility, and this is where we help quite a bit. Complete visibility of all assets of all asset types. Again, I preached on it quite hard. The very thorough and thoughtful application of multi-factor authentication for all remote access. I mentioned something here that I call virtual zero trust. Let me explain that just for a quick second. I'm going to go back a couple of slides. And what I mean by virtual zero trust, okay, is any one of these PLCs is going to be talking to a specific engineering workstation. So if I end up making specific policies that kind of lock down this communication pattern, I've kind of implemented a form of zero trust networking. So if something from outside decides it wants to talk to a PLC over here, I'm going to know about it straight away. So even though I have implicit trust within this environment, and I implicitly trust everything, I can implement a form of zero trust networking by monitoring what's going on here and by alerting when apparently illegitimate connections or communication patterns begin to take place. So that's what I mean by virtual zero trust, which is kind of an interesting concept. And then, of course, we have what I talked about a few slides ago, IT and OT external parties that are having an influence on critical infrastructure, indirectly or directly. So I'm pretty much getting towards the end. Just a couple of things. And this special publication 800-207 is like the holy Bible of zero trust architecture, and it's worth having a look at if you have the time. You don't have to read the whole thing, you just kind of skim it and get an idea of what a lot of the concepts are. But basically, we're kind of establishing these 4 primary tenets that should be followed. First and foremost is know everything that you've got, because if you don't know, excuse me, your full asset inventory, then you don't know what you need to worry about implementing zero trust on. Make sure that the systems that implement zero trust are as secure as they possibly can be. Have a tight integration with your existing ecosystem, meaning you're monitoring the systems, monitoring the environments for any indications of compromise, and monitoring all the zero trust activity to make sure it's what you expect. And last but not least, implement this as a continuous function, continuous monitoring function that that you should do to ensure that you remain in a healthy and secure state. Quick thing, this is kind of Singapore-ish, but it's worth mentioning. CCOP, the Cybersecurity Code of Practice, was recently updated a little bit. A couple of things of note. It was released on July 4th, but operators have a 1-year grace period. It's trying to embrace the technical challenges that are specific to the adoption of new technologies presently, among them 5G networks, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and so on. And it also does a lot to cover protection requirements and detection requirements to make it easier for operators of critical infrastructure to detect when their CII may have been compromised. So just sorry about the coughing. Just a quick reminder about CCOP, because that's another handy piece of another tool that I think should be in everybody's toolkit are the guidances provided by the CCOP. Couple things on Tenable, excuse me. Where just a quick reminder, number one in market share for vulnerability management for 3 years in a row. So we've successfully displaced our principal two competitors in the vulnerability management space. We have our research team is in excess of 200 people, which is larger than the entire employee population of our two major competitors in the operational technology space alone. Think about that for a minute. That's just our research department. And as you've seen earlier, our breadth of understanding, the things that we can analyze and study go beyond just our traditional product family. So again, this is our product portfolio. Vulnerability management. Very new is external attack surface management. You're going to be seeing that coming up very soon. This is a technology that's going to enable you to look at your external, basically everything that touches the internet and give you a report on it that has something to do with your organization. It's an automated tool that you point and fire, and then everything that touches the internet, whether it should or shouldn't be, think Showdown, by the way, because it kind of does a little bit of what that does. You're going to get a report on, and you know what things you might have that you need to worry about that shouldn't be connected to the internet. We have web application security, cloud security, of course, my favorite subject, operational security, and very significantly, a tool to help you analyze your Active Directory environments for weaknesses and vulnerabilities. This is something you shouldn't overlook, okay? Because the vast majority of successful cyber attacks against critical infrastructure really began and were greatly assisted by Active Directory misconfigurations and accounts that shouldn't have been there and accounts that had excess levels of privilege and so on. So this is actually a piece of software that you probably want to have a nice hard look at because it's going to do an awful lot to help you secure your overall environment. And with that, I said I would keep it relatively short, given that it's a apparently gloomy Friday in the Philippines. Here in Singapore, we got a bit of sunshine. We just finished a thunderstorm a few minutes ago, but that's gone. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns that the audience would like to address? If so, now would be a splendid time to ask them.
Thank you very much, Dick, for that insightful presentation.
You're very welcome, sir.
Thank you, Dick, for sharing that presentation. Could you please stop sharing the screen so we can have a discussion
Sorry,
with
of course. It's done.
board members?
Yep.
Yes.
In relation with what Dick discussed regarding Zero Trust, no, I just want to share, Vice Chair and VP Sheila and Mr. Chair, some stats that I get. I attended the CXO event early this week, and it composed of cyber experts in the region. No? So I have a very recent stats regarding ransomware, since Dick discussed about the connection of ransomware to Zero Trust. No? And this is very alarming. No? So just to share with our audience right now, because there are also audience from the other parts of the region, Singapore 7 hosting is here. Did you know, guys, that the APAC is the top region for ransomware attacks right now? So it comprises of 51 times of ransomware attack per week we are experiencing in APAC, no? So compared to North America, Europe, Latin America, and Africa, so APAC is the most targeted one. So it note 168% increase from 2020 to 2021. But the surprising data that I got is that the Philippines, our country, is the #1 most targeted by ransomware attack. And then it says, the study says 69% of Philippine companies got affected by ransomware in 2021. And unfortunately, 51% of those paid ransom, no? And true enough, Vice Chair Oka, no, kasi I am going to the field right now, and there are a lot of requests from the customers to us, to PLDT, to help them because they get ransomware, no? The first one I attended to is a manufacturing company. The second one is a shipping company. There are also FMCG companies who are being ransomware right now, no? So this is really an alarming, and I think the zero trust discussion really pays part of this, how to prevent the ransomware attack.
Yeah,
And I'll add to that, ransomware is particularly insidious if it makes it into critical infrastructure, because the problem is most of those compute resources within the critical infrastructure are probably not patched. Might be Windows 7, might be Windows XP, maybe be Windows 2000 for all you know. Highly vulnerable and very, very easy to take out. And if I take out level 2 of the Purdue model, I basically shut the facility down. And then what are you going to do? You're losing $1 million a day. You're going to pay the ransom and you're going to be quiet about it, right?
Yeah, I think in relation to zero trust, so there is a study also that says 100% of all breaches came from allowed access. No? And I think this is the relevance of our topic today. And Richard, again, it's a fantastic presentation that you have just shared to our audience, and to the community, So I think we will all learn from this. Just remember, 100. That's why when you talk about 3 factors, it's really very important for companies and even us, because most of us have online accounts. So if you can do 3 factors at a minimum, if possible, then do it. At a minimum, maybe 2-factor, but if you can, 3-factor.
Agree.
So yeah, Colonial Pipeline, it's allowed access. Former employee no longer working from Russia. Just imagine the lack of visibility that Colonial Pipeline has. That's why I think when you mentioned about 100% visibility is what brings us to a zero trust architecture, it's truly right.
Yeah.
I agree, Vice Chair. Mr. Press, you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to start off my question the same manner that Dick started his presentation with a quote. I'd like to start off my question with a quote, an interesting quote from Eric Schmidt, of one of the founders of Google. He said that the internet is one of man's greatest experiments in anarchy. And based on that premise, I'd like to show this just as a trigger for our discussion. I actually used this slide in a presentation I gave to a bunch of lawyers a couple of months ago. And this was bearing on the fundamental issues of technology, which of course creates a lot of our problems in cybersecurity. And I'd like to take advantage of Tenable's global footprint and Dick's expertise basically to address the question, if the internet started as a sort of wild, wild west, and all of the technologies that made the internet possible was, basically a mishmash. Are we headed towards an environment, Dick, where, all of these issues have been addressed and we're going towards that era of better, shall we say, governance and better standards, especially in technology? So we're talking basically about 4 issues, right? Money, the need for profit. So people always go for the lowest cost and the most profit. Therefore, quality and security takes a hit. They always want to be the first to go to market. Therefore, an imperfect product always finds itself being sold, therefore needing a lot of patching, rework, and all that. Third would be, increasing complexity. Fourth, of course, man is indispensable in any avenue of society. Therefore, there will always be the permanent insider threat. And lastly, of course, is that technology is never neutral, and therefore the importance of baking in good engineering and design. So maybe as a take-off point, Dick, I'd like us to discuss it along those lines. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, well, that's actually a very good question. And I'm of the opinion a lot of people have to realize something's wrong before they go about to fix it. Okay. Now, let me go back to one simple thing that's happened probably over the past 5 or 6 years. You will notice that every single website is now HTTPS.
Yep.
Why? Because it prevents exactly one of the ills that I was talking about, which is the man in the middle modifying the data, right? And even for a news website, I now know that the news that I'm reading from the New York Times is what the New York Times typed into the computer, and that Singtel hasn't gone around and taken out things that say bad things about the prime minister, right? Okay, so I can trust the source of my information better than I could a while ago. People did this because they realized that it was fundamentally broken and we need to protect the integrity of the messages. Likewise, most banks are at the point now where if I want to access my account information, I have to do it through an app that sits on my iPhone or on my Android device, right? So the banks are realizing that two-factor authentication is fundamentally important and must be implemented. And it's even gotten to the point now where I try and do a transaction in India and it gets declined because I'm in India. Okay, so now there's my three-factor authentication. So my opinion is we are moving in the right direction. The internet was created as a way for academics to talk to each other. Its intent was to be wide open, but the inventors of the internet never imagined what they had created. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind about that, you know. So yeah, there's still things that the majority of I think the majority of the successful phishing and ransomware attacks are probably not occurring because of lack of authentication, although some still will. They're really occurring because people are stupid and they fall for phishing attacks, you know? And someone will call up, this has been happening quite a bit. Someone will call you on the phone, pretend they're from your IT department. You give them sensitive information, they log into your account and they're in your world. And this basically circumvents every single bloody every single technical solution you've solved. So what I'm saying, I guess, is the human dimension continues to play a very important part in all this.
Well, as they say, Dick, there's a sucker born every minute.
Yeah, and I almost fell for one about 2 weeks ago. I'll admit
a
it.
victim.
So I think VP Sheila, we probably have some questions, right? Since we have a couple of more minutes before we hit the 6 p.m. mark, would you like to go into those questions?
Yes, Mr. Press, thank you so much. So it's good news for our Kapix Pro members. You know, we have our Ayuda. It's back again. So we're giving away a 2,000 gift certificate or GCash or Maya for the lucky winners. So the first question is, what can I do to help protect what you call wherever land? So again, this is a very nice phrase, no? I saw in the presentation of our speaker today, wherever land, meaning, you know, you work anywhere, everywhere. So that's the question again. Please answer, type hashtag PixPro,
then your
and a
answer.
ball, and then the answer.
Okay, you want me to keep my mouth shut, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Please.
for a moment.
No coaching.
Yeah, well, they're answering. Batiin natin yung mga Kapix Pro natin na nandito. May nakita ako. Si Seven Hosting, hinahanap niya si VP Mia. VP Mia send her regards to you, Seven Hosting from Singapore. They are using Tenable daw, Dick, on their infrastructure in Singapore. No?
Good.
So si Ding Amar, welcome sa Pix Pro, Ding. Randy Bibar, nandito rin. Si Sir Joe Maliwat, good afternoon, sir.
Joe just got his PixPro ID and certificate of membership.
Oh, congratulations,
Okay,
Joe.
for our members, that's good news. You'll be getting yours soon as well.
Yeah. Meron na ba sagot, VP Sheila?
Ano?
Yes, may answers na, but I need your consensus. The first one I got from our Facebook is from Sir Tyrion. VP Alex, can you check if you also got the same? If it's the first one?
Yep,
Okay.
Tyrion is the first one.
All right. So Dick, the answer is zero trust. Is that correct?
It's one of the answers. I was kind of looking for a little something else, and I'm assuming that wherever land might be your home network, which means look for in your own house, computers that are not patched. Look at what your kids are doing on the computers, and take a look at the firewall and basically your access point into your house to see if it is secure, and if it's not secure, maybe replace it with something that's a little bit higher end. Second piece of advice is never, ever, 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 ever use, excuse me, a public open Wi-Fi network, ever. Okay? Because these are just very basic things that I think will help a lot to prevent compromises of what happens to be in your environment. That was my answer.
All right. Should we accept that answer, VP Alex? I think the answer should
Yeah.
be zero trust at home.
Zero trust at home is good. Yeah, don't forget though, important part of zero trust is the asset that you're using to access the critical stuff needs to be something that's very well maintained and dedicated to the purpose. I think that's a big part that a lot of people miss, right? So yeah, I have two-factor authentication, but I'm doing it on the same PC my kid is playing games on. That's not particularly secure,
Especially if
All
it's
right.
box.
Thanks for expounding, Dick. Okay, so Sir Tyrion, congratulations. You're the first winner.
So
Bili
next
ka ng
question.
cherry pearl para lumaki ka, Tyrion.
So he's probably a fan of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Game of Thrones.
So next question, VP Sheila.
All right. Question number 2. What can I do to help protect lower layers in my OT infrastructure? So it's a bit more technical.
Right, let's see if they're listening.
Okay, let me repeat. What can I do to help protect lower layers in my OT infrastructure? So those paying attention, I'm sure you can answer this.
Nandito rin pala yung mga bata ni Chairman sa PLDT Smart, no? Sila Bunny Hunsay.
Oh, my teammate, Bunny.
Si Wendell Palaon. Good afternoon, bro. I Traverse. Nandito lagi yan every week.
Okay, we'll repeat lang yung format ng answer natin. #PixPro, Tenable, and then the answer.
Do we have a winner?
Nahirapan.
Medyo mahirapan.
VP Alex, would you like to read some of the answers?
Yeah, some of the answers here are disable USB port, number 1. Patch vulnerability, number 2. Authenticate everything through 2 or 3-factor authentication, number 4. Deployment of security control. Iba-iba, no? How would you answer this, Dick? What is the correct answer?
Well, implementing zero trust on there doesn't make any sense, so that's not the answer for that. The answer I was looking for was that virtual zero trust method, which basically says what you do is you baseline what's there, and you look for things that are different from the baseline that could be early indicators of compromise. That's kind of what I was. That's kind of what I was thinking, because the technologies at that level don't have the capability of really doing zero trust, and deploying zero trust at that level would be pretty much impossible. Okay, because just
Sorry guys, wala nakakuha ng tamang sagot dito sila.
that might have been too hard of a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
What
what I suggest,
nakuha niya eh. Pero
what I suggest, VP Sheila, is we save this prize for the second question for the next session,
yeah.
Okay.
and so we can move on to our third. I don't know how they'll do on the third question, because if they didn't get the second one, all I can say is good luck on the third question. Go ahead, VP Sheila.
Yes, Press. Actually, somebody got it, but the format of the answer is incorrect. So sorry, Ding, better luck next time. Again, format should be hashtag PixPro, Tenable, and then the answer. So for our third,
Instruction ka eh.
Yeah. So guys, if you're gonna work in cybersecurity, the first skill you have to learn is precision.
Yeah.
Precision is everything. So, okay, I think we need to hammer that lesson home. So VP Sheila, third question.
all right. So for the final question, what can I do to protect devices allocated by my company to facilitate secure remote access to critical infrastructure?
Good question.
Yeah. Knowledge check if you are really listening, mga Kapix Pro.
Okay, so I'll repeat it. What can I do to protect devices allocated by my company to facilitate secure remote access to critical infrastructure?
Hashtag PixPro Tenable and then your answer.
Okay, while we're waiting for the answers to come in, someone has a question. So we have a question from Mr. Ding Amar. Hi, sir. What would you say that identity and privilege access management can be considered as an entry point for Zero Trust to start with? So would you say that identity and privilege access management can be considered as an entry point for Zero?
I would say absolutely. Who you are and what level of privilege is an entry point for sure. But that's just one part of it. The dual factor authentication and the message integrity as it goes through the untrusted infrastructure is equally important.
Thanks, Dick. VP Alex, would you like to read the answers to the
Yeah,
third
these
question?
are our answers from our viewers. Authenticate no, sorry. Two-factor, three-factor authentication using MFA, three-factor authentication, use MFA, multi-factor. Same.
Everybody likes MFA. Good.
MFA? Okay, who's the winner, VP Sheila?
So it has to be the first one who got it right.
Yeah, I can see Tebo. Is that the same with you?
Si Tebo, oh. Kaka-member lang yan, ha?
Yep, Ebo.
All right, congratulations. So our secretariat will reach out to the two winners to get your prize. Thank you guys for participating.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Just in time, our chairman is back and we have just breached the 6 p.m. mark. So before we go, I think since we have just been joined by Vice Chair Oka for after some time in hiatus, maybe we could first ask Dick for his final words before we turn it over for the last word to our Vice Chair. Dick, any final messages?
These won't be my final words. They'll be my final words for this session.
Of course.
I'm not going to drop that yet.
No. Sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. It's no, the whole thing is it's we're at the point now, we're at kind of a tipping point where we've become so heavily dependent on the internet, it has to be 100% secure. And this is, I think, the thing that's really forcing this in my mind is what we've talked about for a couple of years, which is convergence of critical infrastructure with everything else. And I think that every organization that's got something that is, critically important to life, limb, and property needs to really urgently start to migrate towards these technologies, because there's still way too much that's open and easy to crack. And I think we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet. But there is a sense of urgency to it. That's my final word for today.
Thank you, Dick. And Mr. Chair, of course, your privilege as chairman, or shall we defer to Vice Chair Oscar?
Let's defer to the Vice Chair. We missed the Vice Chair for so many sessions.
Vice Chair, can we hear from you?
My final words, going back to the colonial pipeline, no, where VPN is the reason why there was a breach, no, and then there was the CTNA 1.0 that tried to fix it. But now we have what we call the CTNA 2.0, and that will be a topic for next time. But it's all related to zero trust, and our topic today. That's why I mentioned that. No? Some VPN to CTNA 1.0 to CTNA 2.0, and then with that, Mr. Chair.
Well, another very interesting topic
Yep.
that we have concluded for this Friday's Kwentuhang Cybersecurity. And it's Friday. We usually say happy weekend to everyone. But
Weekend.
unfortunately, we are in cybersecurity. Happy lang. Walang weekend.
In English,
Thank you, Nick.
just be
Thank you
happy.
so much, Nick.
We have the weekend.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everybody. Happy weekend.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Tenable.
Everyone, thank you.
Tenable.